Chains rattled in the cold December night of 1825. On a Louisiana plantation, screams echoed from beneath the earth, an overseer gasping for air, clawing at the dirt that smothered him. His tormentor was no stranger. He was a slave, once beaten and broken, now consumed by vengeance. On Christmas night, while the plantation feasted in false joy, one man turned the soil itself into a coffin. What led him to bury his overseer alive would shock history forever. The winter of 1825 in Louisiana was heavy with damp air and the scent of pine smoke. The plantation stretched endlessly, rows of cane glistening with frost beneath the pale moonlight. To outsiders, it was a place of prosperity, a great house with tall white columns, a barn stacked with supplies, and fields that promised wealth. But for those bound in chains, it was a prison without walls. It was here that Samuel was born into bondage, a slave on the Davenport plantation. Samuel's earliest memories were not of freedom, but of chains clinking as his mother worked the fields with swollen hands. He remembered the cracking whip, the muffled sobs at night, the constant fear that lingered like a shadow. His father, once strong and proud, had been sold away when Samuel was only 6. The boy had clung to his mother's skirt, begging to go too, but the master's cold reply echoed forever. "You stay. You're mine now." From that day, Samuel grew under the harsh eye of the overseer, Mr. Harlan Graves. Graves was not just feared. He was hated. A man with a face as sharp as a blade, his voice barked like thunder across the fields. He carried his whip like a second arm, and he enjoyed using it. To Graves, slaves were not human, they were tools. Tools that could be worked, beaten, or broken. Samuel, even as a boy, felt the overseer's cruelty more than most. If Samuel stumbled while carrying heavy baskets of cane, Graves would lash him until his back ran red. If he slowed down from exhaustion, Graves would order him to stand in the cold, shackled, while the other slaves worked past him. Every scar on Samuel's back became a reminder. This man would not stop until he destroyed him. But Samuel's mother whispered words of hope at night. She spoke of God, of deliverance, of nights when chains would break. She taught him to endure, to keep his anger hidden deep where the overseer could not see it. "A storm," she told him, "does not reveal itself until it breaks the sky." Samuel listened, and inside him, that storm gathered silently. By his teenage years, Samuel was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong from endless labor. His hands were rough, his body hardened, but his eyes still carried that fire of resistance. Other slaves admired his quiet strength. He rarely spoke, but when he did, they listened. He learned to chop cane with speed, to haul barrels without complaint, to survive under the overseer's merciless gaze. Yet behind every task, there was a seed of rage. The plantation itself was a cruel kingdom. At the top stood Master Edward Davenport, a man of wealth and appearances. He preferred to keep his hands clean, so he allowed Graves to enforce discipline. Davenport's mistress, Clara, often looked away when the whip cracked. She hosted feasts, dressed in silks, and prayed loudly in church while ignoring the cries from the fields. To them, Samuel and the others were invisible shadows. Christmas was the one season when a false kindness drifted across the plantation. Slaves were sometimes given scraps of food, a moment to sing by the fire, even a day without field work. But beneath that thin veil of generosity lay chains just as heavy as ever. Samuel despised Christmas because it reminded him of freedom he would never have. The masters feasted, the slaves watched, and Graves kept his whip ready. One Christmas, when Samuel was 17, Graves decided to teach a lesson. A young girl, barely 15, had dropped a tray of food during the Davenport feast. The overseer dragged her outside in the cold, tied her to a post, and whipped her until she collapsed. Samuel stood among the others, his fists trembling, every muscle screaming to intervene. But he knew, one move, and the whip would find him too. He buried the anger deep. That night, by the flickering fire in the slave quarters, Samuel whispered to himself, "One day, I'll make him pay." Years passed, and Samuel became a man. He had seen slaves sold away, families ripped apart, children hanged for trying to escape. He had seen women used and broken, men beaten until they couldn't stand. Every injustice carved hatred deeper into him. Graves took special pleasure in tormenting Samuel, as if he sensed the defiance hidden in him. More than once, Graves said, "Boy, I'll bury you myself one day." Those words stayed with Samuel, but not in the way Graves expected. By 1825, Samuel was in his early 20s, powerful in body but scarred in spirit. He carried the weight of 1,000 lashes, yet he had not broken. And as Christmas approached, he began to feel the storm inside him stir. He watched as the Davenports prepared for their great holiday feast, candles in the windows, barrels of wine unloaded, a fat hog roasted for celebration. The house would be filled with laughter, songs, and blessings of peace. But Samuel knew peace had never lived here. Only chains, only cruelty, only graves. That winter night, while the overseer strutted about the plantation with his whip coiled at his side, Samuel's thoughts turned darker than ever before. The words of his mother returned. A storm does not reveal itself until it breaks the sky. And Samuel felt that sky cracking. Something was coming. Something Graves could never imagine. The cold of December bit deeper with every passing day. On the Davenport plantation, the sugarcane harvest was nearly finished, yet the overseer's cruelty did not rest. Harlan Graves seemed almost invigorated by the season, as if the coming Christmas feast gave him license to remind the slaves of their place. For Samuel, every lash, every command, every sneer dug deeper into the storm brewing within him. He had endured countless torments over the years, but that winter, something inside him shifted. The overseer's cruelty showed itself in ways both brutal and cunning. Graves often forced the slaves to work before dawn, when the frost turned the cane fields into shimmering blades of ice. Their hands bled from the sharp leaves, their breaths puffed out in the frozen air, but there was no mercy. "Move faster!" Graves barked, his whip slicing through the air. Chains don't care for cold. One morning, Samuel's friend Elias stumbled. His foot, raw from frostbite, slipped on the frozen ground. Before Samuel could help him up, Graves was already there. With a twisted smile, he lashed Elias across the back. The man cried out, falling to his knees. Graves struck again and again, his voice booming over the field. This is what happens when slaves slow down. You're beasts, and beasts must be driven. Samuel clenched his fists until his knuckles cracked. His body screamed to strike Graves down, to end the torment right there. But he knew the cost. If he rose in anger, not only would he suffer, but Elias and every slave who looked up to him would pay. So Samuel lifted Elias, steadying him with a quiet whisper, "Hold on, brother. Hold on." Graves saw the act of kindness, and for a moment, their eyes met. Samuel expected the whip. Instead, Graves smirked and said, "One day, boy, you'll learn. I'll make sure of it." The words were like a spark on dry straw. As Christmas drew closer, preparations filled the plantation. Barrels of wine, crates of oranges, sacks of flour, all brought in for the great Davenport feast. Slaves hauled the goods into the big house, where Mistress Clara supervised with delicate hands and false smiles. The scent of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen, making Samuel's stomach knot. The irony was cruel. On Christmas, the masters feasted in excess while the slaves, who made the feast possible, received only scraps. Graves made sure of that. He took delight in ordering Samuel and others to serve at the table, forcing them to carry platters while guests laughed and drank. One evening, Samuel overheard Graves speaking with another overseer visiting from a nearby plantation. They shared whiskey by the barn, their voices low but sharp. "These slaves think Christmas means kindness," Graves sneered. "But I don't soften my hand. In fact, I strike harder. Keeps them from getting ideas." The other overseer laughed. "One day, they'll rise against you." Graves' reply was chilling. "Let them try. I'll bury any who dare." Samuel, hidden in the shadows, froze at the words. He remembered every lash, every humiliation, every friend broken under Graves' whip. "I'll bury any who dare." The overseer's boast echoed like a curse. But Samuel thought of it differently. What if, this Christmas, it was Graves who tasted the earth? The nights grew longer, and with them, the cruelty. On Christmas Eve, the slaves were granted a half day from the fields, a gift from Master Davenport. But Graves refused to let the moment pass without blood. He gathered them in the yard, his whip coiled at his side. The sky was gray, the air sharp, the world silent but for his voice. "You think tomorrow is your day?" he barked. "You think chains break because of some holy night? Know you belong to this land, to the Master, to me. Christmas or no Christmas, you're slaves until death. Remember that." Then, as if to brand his words into their flesh, he chose one at random, a young man named Josiah, and struck him across the face. Blood spattered on the frozen ground. The other slaves lowered their eyes, swallowing their rage. But Samuel stared straight ahead, his gaze fixed not on the ground, but on Graves himself. It was subtle, but the overseer noticed. Their eyes locked. For a moment, the world shrank to two men, one in chains, one with the whip. Graves smirked. "Careful, boy. Eyes like that will get you buried." Samuel said nothing, but inside, the storm roared. That night, in the slave quarters, Samuel lay awake. The others whispered prayers, sang quiet hymns, clung to what little hope they could muster. But Samuel's mind was elsewhere. He replayed the years of cruelty, the laughter at others' pain, the threats Graves had hurled. And then he thought of his mother's words, spoken long ago. "A storm does not reveal itself until it breaks the sky." Samuel realized the storm was no longer waiting. It was time. Christmas morning dawned with pale sunlight on frost. The plantation stirred with activity. The great feast was to be held that night. Guests from nearby estates would arrive, dressed in their finery, praising God and blessing the Davenports' hospitality while ignoring the chains rattling in the shadows. Samuel moved through the day with an eerie calm. His hands chopped wood, carried barrels, served in the kitchen, but his mind was elsewhere. The overseer barked orders, but Samuel hardly heard them. Instead, he studied Graves' every movement. The way he strutted, the way he boasted, the way he never suspected that the man he had beaten for years now watched him with the eyes of vengeance. The feast approached. The hog was roasted, the wine poured, the candles lit. Guests filled the hall, laughter ringing through the house. Slaves served in silence, their eyes downcast, their chains unseen by those who dined. Graves, smug and satisfied, stood outside near the barn, drinking and laughing, his whip hanging loosely at his side. And Samuel knew. This was the night. This Christmas would not pass like the others. Something was going to happen, something that would be spoken of in whispers long after the candles burned out. The sun slipped behind the cane fields, leaving the plantation wrapped in shadows. Christmas night had come. Inside the Davenport mansion, the feast had begun. Laughter spilled out from the windows, mingling with the smell of roasted hog, sweet pies, and mulled wine. Candles flickered against polished silver, and Mistress Clara's voice rose above the chatter, offering a prayer of thanks. But beyond the walls of warmth and luxury, the night belonged to another kind of prayer, one whispered in chains, one bound in fury. Samuel stood near the barn, his hand steady, though his heart thundered. He carried a barrel of firewood for the feast, but his mind was far from the tasks of servitude. For weeks, perhaps years, he had wrestled with an unspoken truth. Cruelty could not be endured forever. And now, as the overseer's laughter echoed across the yard, Samuel felt something inside him snap into resolve. Harlan Graves was drunk. Christmas gave him an excuse to indulge without restraint. He drank heavily from a jug of rum, his words slurring as he boasted to a fellow guest outside the barn. "These fools think Christmas frees them," Graves laughed, waving his whip in the air. "But Christmas or not, a slave is still a slave. I'll break their bones tomorrow if I feel like it. Tonight, I drink. Tomorrow, I whip." The guest laughed nervously, shifting uncomfortably before retreating back toward the glow of the mansion. Graves was left alone, swaying slightly, the jug in one hand, the whip in the other. Samuel, stacking the firewood nearby, heard every word. His jaw tightened. Every lash, every humiliation, every scar burned anew. He looked at the dirt beneath his feet. How many times had he bled into this ground? How many tears had fallen into it? And then the thought struck him. The earth had taken so much from the slaves, perhaps tonight it would take something from Graves. The plan began to take shape not with tools or weapons, but with silence. Samuel moved carefully, blending in with the night's work. He carried trays, hauled water, stacked logs. No one suspected that behind his calm eyes, revenge was taking form. Near the barn was a patch of soft earth, loosened from weeks of digging a ditch for drainage. Samuel had worked on it himself. He knew the ground there was weak, damp, and easy to shift. He glanced at it now, a subtle glance, but enough to plant the seed of possibility. Later, while carrying another load of wood, Samuel whispered to Elias, his trusted friend, "Stay close tonight. If you hear a struggle, don't intervene. Just trust me." Elias frowned, worry flashing in his eyes. "What are you planning?" Samuel's reply was a whisper sharp as steel. "Justice." The night deepened. Inside, the feast grew louder. Glasses clinked, songs filled the hall, and Mistress Clara clapped her hands as carols were sung. Slaves carried platters back and forth, heads bowed, eyes hidden. But outside, near the barn, the overseer's laughter rang louder than the hymns of peace. Graves stumbled toward the woodpile, whip dragging behind him. "Samuel," he barked. "More wood for the fire. Now." Samuel appeared instantly, as obedient as ever. He carried an armful of logs, setting them down near the barn. Graves smirked, stepping closer, the stench of rum heavy on his breath. "You've got strong arms, boy," he slurred. "Shame they're wasted on chains." "Maybe I ought to break them, just to remind you who owns you." Samuel said nothing. His silence was not submission, it was calculation. He watched as Graves leaned against the barn wall, laughing to himself, his whip dangling carelessly. This was the moment. The overseer swayed, muttering curses under his breath. Samuel's eyes flicked to the patch of soft earth, not 10 steps away. His mind raced, but his body remained calm. He took a slow breath, the cold air burning his lungs. Then, he moved. With the strength of years of forced labor, Samuel lunged. His hands shot forward, knocking the jug of rum from Graves' grip. The overseer stumbled in surprise, his drunken reflexes too slow. Before he could raise the whip, Samuel's arm slammed across his chest, driving him backward toward the patch of damp earth. Graves roared, thrashing, but Samuel was stronger, fueled by rage older than his scars. They struggled in the darkness, boots kicking up mud, fists pounding against flesh. Graves managed to strike Samuel across the face, but the blow only hardened Samuel's fury. With a guttural shout, Samuel twisted, throwing the overseer down into the softened ground. Graves landed with a heavy thud, the mud sucking at his body. He cursed, struggling to rise, but Samuel was already upon him. The earth gave way beneath them, the ditch collapsing into a shallow pit. Samuel pressed Graves down, shoving his face toward the soil. The overseer kicked and clawed, but Samuel's hands were unyielding. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt the balance shift. The whip no longer ruled him. His hands did. His strength did. Graves' muffled screams filled the night, drowned by the muffling dirt. His arms flailed, his boots thrashed, but Samuel held him with the force of every lash, every humiliation, every stolen life. The overseer gasped, his mouth filling with soil. His eyes bulged with terror. For the first time, Harlan Graves tasted the very earth he had sworn to bury others in. Samuel whispered into his ear, his voice low and trembling with fury. "You said you'd bury me one day. Tonight, it's you who goes into the ground." The struggle grew weaker. Graves' arms slowed, his kicks faltered. Samuel did not let go. With each handful of dirt pressed over the overseer's body, Samuel felt the weight of years lifting from his shoulders. The earth that had drunk so much slave blood now swallowed its oppressor. Nearby, Elias watched in horror and awe, frozen by what he saw. Other slaves, carrying trays toward the mansion, paused briefly at the shadows near the barn. They saw enough to know. The storm had finally broken. And yet, inside the mansion, laughter and music continued, blind to the vengeance being carried out only yards away. When the earth stilled, when Graves' body no longer fought, Samuel rose, chest heaving, sweat freezing on his brow. His hands were caked in mud, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He looked up at the stars, his breath clouding the cold air. For the first time in his life, Samuel felt something close to freedom. But he also knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning. What came next would decide everything. The barn was silent now, save for the faint drip of rum spilled into the mud and the ragged breath of Samuel as he stood over the fresh grave of Harlan Graves. The earth had swallowed the overseer whole. The man who once wielded the whip with absolute power was gone, buried alive in the very ground he claimed to own. But Samuel knew the night was not finished. The overseer's death was a spark. And sparks, when they touch dry straw, create fire. The Christmas feast thundered on inside the mansion. Fiddles sang, glasses clinked, and laughter rolled across the walls like a cruel hymn. The masters and their guests praised the birth of Christ, blind to the storm that had already broken outside. Samuel, chest still heaving, turned from the pit of mud. His eyes met Elias, who had watched in silence, frozen with both fear and awe. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Samuel broke the silence. "It's done," he whispered. "But it cannot end here." Elias swallowed hard. "Samuel, if they find out, they will find out," Samuel cut in, his voice like iron. "And when they do, chains will come for us all. Unless tonight, we break them first." Samuel's words rippled through the slave quarters like a secret fire. Men and women gathered close, their eyes wide, their hearts torn between fear and hope. Some trembled at the thought of what had been done. Others, for the first time in their lives, let themselves imagine a night without chains. Samuel spoke with quiet fury. "Graves is gone, buried by my hand. Tonight, they feast while we bleed. But if we act now, if we strike while their bellies are full and their heads drowned in wine, we can end their laughter." Silence held the room. Then an old man, his back scarred from decades of the whip, rasped, "What do you mean to do, boy?" Samuel's eyes gleamed with a fire no chain could hold. "Burn it. Burn the house. Burn the plantation. Let the flames take what they built on our backs. Tonight, we are the storm." The decision was not made with cheers or shouts, but with solemn nods, with the tightening of fists, with the silent understanding of people who had suffered too long. The women prepared cloths to mask the smoke, the men gathered tools, axes, shovels, torches. Every movement was sharp, quiet, deliberate. Samuel led them out into the night. The December air was icy, the stars sharp as blades above. From the mansion came the sound of a hymn. "Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Samuel's jaw tightened. Peace, he thought bitterly, built on chains. But tonight, chains would break. They began with fire. Samuel dipped cloth into oil stored in the barn, wrapping it around sticks to fashion torches. One by one, flames burst to life, crackling in the cold night. The slaves stood in a circle, faces lit by firelight, eyes reflecting a fury long suppressed. Samuel raised his torch high. "For every lash," he said. A torch lifted in reply. For every family torn apart, another torch rose. For every soul buried in chains, the circle burned brighter. Samuel's voice thundered. "Tonight, we burn it all." They moved like shadows across the yard, their torches licking the air. Samuel led the way to the mansion, its windows glowing with laughter and light. He could see Mistress Clara inside, raising her glass in toast. Master Davenport roared with drunken cheer, oblivious to the storm gathering at his gates. Samuel thrust his torch into the wall of the kitchen, dry timber catching instantly. Flames leapt upward, hungry and wild. The others followed, at the stables, the barn, the storehouse. Soon the night was alive with fire, crackling like the rage of 100 years unleashed. Smoke curled into the sky. Sparks rained down. And still, inside the mansion, the feast carried on, until the first scream split the night. Fire! Fire! The guests surged to their feet, panic spilling into the room. Flames licked the windows, smoke poured through the halls. Mistress Clara shrieked, clutching her pearls. Master Davenport bellowed orders, but his voice was drowned by chaos. Outside, Samuel and his people stood like avenging spirits, torches blazing in their hands. Davenport burst onto the porch, his face pale with terror. He saw Samuel standing at the head of the slaves, firelight casting him in the glow of rebellion. For a moment, master and slave locked eyes, the oppressor and the oppressed, the man of wealth and the man in chains. "You," Davenport roared. "What have you done?" Samuel's reply was cold as steel. "What you never expected." The master stumbled back as flames consumed the mansion behind him. Guests fled into the yard, coughing and crying, their silk smeared with soot. Horses screamed from the burning stables. The plantation, once a monument to wealth, was collapsing into ash. But Samuel's vengeance was not yet finished. Amid the chaos, he strode forward, chains still clinking around his wrists. He had not broken them yet, but soon. He seized an axe from the woodpile, its blade gleaming red in the firelight. With a cry that shook the night, he brought it down on the iron shackles at his feet. The chain split, falling to the ground with a metallic thud. The sound echoed like thunder, and every slave watching felt it in their bones. Chains were not eternal. Chains could break. One by one, others followed. Shackles were struck, iron shattered, wrists freed. The ground was littered with broken chains, gleaming in the firelight like fallen serpents. Master Davenport tried to rally the overseer. "Graves! Where is Graves?" he shouted desperately. But Samuel's voice cut through the fire and smoke. "Graves is gone. Buried, just as you will be." The master's face drained of blood. For the first time, he understood. His power was ash, his overseer gone, his slaves no longer bound. Davenport turned to flee, but Samuel was already upon him. With the strength of a man carrying every scar, every lash, every death of his people, Samuel swung the axe. It struck the porch beam beside Davenport, sending splinters flying, a warning blow that froze the master where he stood. "I could slaughter you where you stand," Samuel said, his voice trembling with fury. "But I want you to see your kingdom burn. I want you to watch everything built on chains crumble into nothing." The flames roared higher. The mansion collapsed inward, timbers crashing, sparks shooting into the night sky. The plantation, the symbol of their suffering, was now an inferno. Slaves who had once bowed their heads now stood tall in the glow of freedom. Some wept, some shouted, some simply stared in awe. The fire reflected in their eyes was more than destruction, it was rebirth. Samuel, standing at the center of it all, felt the weight of chains lift from his soul. He had buried the overseer. He had burned the house. He had broken the iron that bound him. But even as freedom blazed around him, he knew the night was not yet over. The flames would draw attention. Other masters, other overseers, the law itself, they would come. And when they did, the storm Samuel had unleashed would spread or be crushed. He looked at his people, their faces shining in the firelight, and spoke the words that would carry them into the unknown. Tonight, we are free. Tomorrow, the world will try to chain us again. But chains can be broken. Remember this night. And with that, Samuel led them away from the burning plantation, into the darkness of the cane fields, where the night awaited them with silence and possibility. The fire roared behind them, a funeral pyre for the overseer, the master, and the world that had enslaved them. Christmas night, 1825, would never be forgotten. The fire consumed the Davenport mansion until nothing remained but embers and charred beams jutting against the night sky like blackened bones. The plantation, once a proud monument of wealth, was reduced to ash in a single night of fury. The overseer was buried beneath the soil. The master had fled into the darkness, his cries lost in the roar of flames. And the slaves, no longer slaves, moved silently into the cane fields, guided by Samuel. The storm had broken, but storms are always followed by silence and by reckoning. The first hours of freedom were not filled with celebration, but with urgency. Samuel led them away from the blaze, deeper into the swamps that stretched beyond the cane. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and the cries of owls echoed through the night. They moved quickly, silently, with only the sound of broken chains rattling in their hands. Children were carried on shoulders, elders supported by strong arms. Elias, ever faithful, stayed at Samuel's side. "Where do we go?" he whispered. Samuel's answer was firm. "Away, north if we can, to where chains cannot reach." But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Chains reached far. Overseers, patrols, hunters with dogs. The world beyond the plantation was not yet freedom, but a wider battlefield. Still, they walked, because to stay was to die. By dawn, the fire was seen for miles. Neighbors came, overseers from nearby plantations rode in, and the news spread like wildfire. "The Davenport slaves have risen," people whispered. "The overseer is dead. The house is burned." Fear gripped the white planters. They tightened chains on their own plantations, fearing rebellion would spread. Some spoke of vengeance, of hunting Samuel and his people down. Others trembled, for they knew, if one plantation could burn, so could theirs. Master Davenport, humiliated and broken, gave his account to the authorities. He claimed the slaves had turned demonic on Christmas night, that Samuel, a dangerous brute, had murdered graves and set the fire. His words dripped with rage, but also with fear. The law was summoned, and patrols began their hunt. Meanwhile, Samuel and his people pressed deeper into the swamps. The water was cold, the mud thick, the air buzzing with mosquitoes. Yet the swamp offered cover that open fields could not. They built fires only when needed, covered themselves in leaves, moved at night. Each step was a fight for survival. But for Samuel, every struggle was worth it. He looked at the children running barefoot, no longer under the whip. He saw mothers carrying babies without fear of them being sold. He saw men walking tall, their backs no longer bent by chains. For the first time, he felt something close to hope. And yet, hope was a fragile flame. It was Elias who asked the question all feared to voice. "Samuel, what if they catch us?" Samuel paused, staring at the murky water ahead. His voice was steady, but heavy with truth. "Then we die as free men, not slaves. Buried not by their whip, but by our choice." The words settled over the group like a solemn vow. Death was a shadow on every side, but for once, it was not their master's shadow, it was their own. Days turned to weeks. Some among the group slipped away, trying to find family on other plantations. Some pressed on, heading north toward whispered promises of freedom. Samuel remained with those who trusted him, guiding them deeper into hiding. But the patrols came closer. One night, dogs barked in the distance and torches flickered between the trees. The hunters were near. Samuel tightened his grip on the axe he still carried, his jaw clenched. "If they come, they'll bleed before we fall." The group held their breath in the darkness. The dogs circled, barked, but turned away, led off by their masters. For that night, the storm remained unseen. Historians would later argue about Samuel's fate. Some claimed he was eventually caught, dragged back in chains, and hanged as an example to others. Some whispered he fought until the end, slaughtering patrolmen before disappearing into the swamp, his body never found. And others swore he made it north, vanishing into freedom, his name changed, his story buried in whispers. What cannot be denied is what he left behind. The Davenport plantation never rose again. Its ruins stood as a scar on the land, a reminder that even the wealthiest master's world could be turned to ash. Other slaves on neighboring estates whispered Samuel's name in secret, passing it down like a forbidden prayer. The slave who buried his overseer alive, the slave who burned the plantation on Christmas night. And so, Samuel's story lived not in books or ledgers, but in memory, in song, in the quiet faith of those still bound in chains. His act was more than rebellion, it was proof. Proof that the whip was not invincible. Proof that chains could be broken. Proof that even on a night meant to celebrate peace, vengeance could strike like lightning. As the years passed, Christmas of 1825 was remembered with fear by the masters and with hope by the enslaved. For one night, the balance had shifted. For one night, the overseer lay buried in the earth, the master fled into the dark, and the slaves walked free beneath the stars. Whether Samuel lived or died, whether he found freedom or the gallows, one truth outlived him. He refused to die in chains. And so the narrator's voice falls quiet, leaving only the crackle of fire and the rattle of broken chains echoing in the darkness. On Christmas night, 1825, Samuel chose vengeance over submission. He buried his overseer alive, burned the plantation, and walked into the night a free man. History may not tell us where his road ended, but it will never forget where it began. Pause. Then the final words, soft but haunting. They buried him in chains every day of his life. But on that Christmas night, Samuel buried his chains instead.